I'd like for you today to take a moment to think about something you're good at. Think about something you're really skilled at. It could be Power BI, it could be Dynamics, it could be cooking, listening. Maybe you're good at a specific sport, maybe it's tennis. Just get that idea, that skill in your mind. I've got mine. Take a second to think back to like when you started developing that skill, your earliest memory. What was it like? Were you good at it from the beginning? Did you have some struggles? Did you make some mistakes along the way? Can you think back now to how much better you are now than when you were when you started? Thinking about that improvement and thinking about how far we've come in different skills is a very valuable exercise to go through and to think through and to reflect on. Because many times, we're in the middle of today, and a lot of times today we think about what we don't know, and we forget to reflect back on all the things we've learned over time. So for me, preparing for this session was a lot of fun because it gave me a bit of a chance to reflect back on my own Power BI journey, where I started from, what I knew way back then, and what I'm capable of doing today. And to take some of those reflections and put it into this presentation today. Power BI has grown. As everybody knows, software evolves over time, and every month there's new stuff coming out in Power BI. And so there's a lot of advancements that are made over time. And those advancements combined with your own skill advancements allow you to make great reports, beautiful reports now that maybe you couldn't before. Or if you're new to Power BI, know that you're going to have the capability. If you get in there, you try it out, you'll be very successful because you've got that skill in your mind. You're capable of learning and progressing. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank the DynamicsCon community for voting for this session. 8.5 Power BI concepts I wish I knew when I started. And these titles are funny because when you're submitting a session to a conference, you kind of just say, you kind of submit your title and your blurb and put it out there and hope for people to vote for it. And then if they vote for it, you have to actually go make the content. So I was joking around with Molly, the session organizer, and talking about what should my title be, because I have no idea how many things I learned until I actually build the content. But since I promised you 8.5 things, I'm going to deliver 8.5 things today. So that's what the session's going to be. I'm Joel Leichty. I'm the Power Practice Manager at Dynamic Consulting. And in kind of the spirit of DynamicsCon, I was thinking about what is my Power BI superpower? What's my superpower in general? And I think for me, my greatest superpower is that I can remember every mistake I've ever made in my life. So I just have that capability. I can bring them up instantly and remember all the mistakes I've made. And so for this kind of session, it really helps me to present this kind of session. Because I can kind of reflect back on all the mistakes I made in Power BI and hopefully share some of those with you today. So I've made mistakes like having ugly reports. I've made mistakes of having too complicated of reports and too many slicers, too many visuals, too many fish on the reports. I've made, some pretty nasty data models and, kind of data going all over the place. I've made reports that no one ever looked at. And, that's kind of depressing. So hopefully I can share some of that knowledge, share some of my experiences, share some of those pitfalls, and we can learn and grow together on this tool. So my first tip is if you're an Excel Power user and you're not using Power BI Desktop yet, start. Like literally go download it right now from the Windows Store. It's free to download. So if you love Excel like I have over the years, then I think you're definitely going to love Power BI. I've been using Excel 20 years, and for all kinds of data analytics, that was kind of my go-to thing. I'd always create a workbook, pull in my data, start massaging it, doing lookups, doing pivot tables and all that stuff. And now I would say that's kind of switched for me. Now Power BI is my go-to for that kind of data manipulation, lookups, you know, kind of exploring data. I've switched, and you know, that's just my default position now. So I think the tools are, you know, relatable enough for users that it's kind of in a fairly easy transition to jump over. So a few things I'll point out that you might like if you're in Excel. So if you love pivot tables like I certainly do, then, and you know, I still know the shortcut for pivot tables from 2003, so I can create one in seconds. Then you're really going to like matrix reports in Power BI. You know, matrix reports is similar to a pivot table. You've got rows down the side, you've got your columns across the top. You can pull in, matrix reports have some advantages over Excel. You can pull in data from many different sources and many different tables. It's got great filtering capabilities, so you can click on a record and kind of see other things update. It's also got great drill through capabilities. So you can click on a specific piece of data and actually jump over to another Power BI experience and see the data in a different way, in a different format, not just drill down into the detailed data, but drill into a new experience. And you can do more advanced calculations in Power BI than you can in Excel. Like, you know, sums with filters and date filters and all kinds of calculations. If you are, you know, doing a lot of lookups and creating data tables in Excel, then I think Power BI is really going to be a powerful tool as well. And the data modeling capabilities of Power BI are going to blow your mind. So you can bring in data from different sources, like I mentioned, and relate that data. You don't have to do so many lookups. You don't have to get everything. I know a lot of times in Excel, we like to build these super long, flat tables of information so we can slice and dice. And you can do all that in Power BI. You can just do it in a more efficient way. And you know, you don't have to create that giant mega file to make it happen. Finally, if you're a master at formulas, you know, you're writing all your sums and ifs and averages, and you really like to use Excel formulas, then you're going to feel right at home in Power BI writing DAX expressions. So most of the functions of Excel have an almost identical cousin in Power BI, where the syntax of the formula is almost identical between the two tools. There's certainly some differences in how you kind of reference ranges in Excel versus how you'd reference a column in Power BI. There's certain unique differences for sure, but I find it very easy to translate over. And you can get more advanced with your calculations in Power BI than Excel. And finally, there's even a website that cross-references every Excel function with its corresponding Power BI DAX function. So there's an easy way to kind of go from one to the other. I certainly wish that Power BI would have been around when I started my Excel journey 20 years ago, because I would have certainly loved to be able to use Power BI and yeah, I would have loved to be able to just kind of start with Power BI or use Excel and Power BI side by side. When you get into BI and Power BI, data modeling and how you structure your data and how you structure your reports is a critical part of learning the tool. And I wish when I started that there was a few concepts that I would have had a better understanding of and a handle on. And there's some concepts that I wish I wouldn't have learned early on, because I think they're overly complicated. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both today. But I think the end goal is when you properly structure your data into a data model, it just makes the reporting easier. And that's what you're really looking for with all this data modeling stuff, is when you go to write your calculations, If your data is structured in a logical way, then your calculations are going to be structured in a logical way, and it's going to flow really nicely. If your data model is kind of all over the place and doesn't really have a structure and things aren't related in the right way, then it's going to be harder to write those calculations, and you're going to kind of fight with the calculation engine. So the first topic I want to bring up is a star schema. I hate bringing up technical terms. I promise this is the only one in the presentation. But a star schema is really a simple way of modeling data. It's not all that complicated. It's kind of funny if you look up the Microsoft article on getting started with BI, it talks about a star schema. It talks about some of these simple concepts, and then it goes on to go BI crazy at the second half of the article and kind of go overboard. But the basics of a star schema is having two types of tables in your model. So you have a fact table, that is a transactional table. That's where numbers are stored. Like, you might have a transactional table like a list of invoices with invoice amounts, GL balances with amounts. And those are the tables that you're going to write sum calculations and add and subtract and multiply and divide. Those calculations are done on your transactional tables, again, known as facts. The second type of table is a dimension. So the dimension is an attribute table. Those are things like descriptions or name fields or grouping fields that you're going to use for your report to pull in, the name of a customer or a customer group or those kind of attributes. So that's it. That's a star schema, facts and dimensions. Now, when you're pulling in data from your source systems, does it all come in the perfect format and it just works? And what are the chances of that happening? Probably zero. So thinking about data transformations and how am I going to get my data set into that structure of having facts and dimensions that relate to each other, you really have to kind of think through that transformation logic and what kinds of transformations are you going to have to do to get your data into the right structure. But it's important to remember that it probably won't work just to pull your data from wherever it's coming from into your model. And I think if you use Excel, you know this because a lot of times we're all doing VLOOKUPs to pull things together. Same kind of thing. That's a form of data transformation to make reporting simpler. And I think the star schema is important because it's always important to have excuse the pun, but a North Star for thinking through your design and thinking through, well, I need to transform it into this fact and dimension type structure. Finally, relationships. So developing relationships with your colleagues, your IT department, your executives, the users of your report, developing good relationships with those people is so important in your BI journey because those people are going to give you feedback on reports and feedback on your data models. And sorry. Okay. I'm just getting word that this is a different type of relationship. So it is important to have good relationships with your colleagues, but I'm being informed that this is talking about BI relationships. So BI relationships are how those fact tables and those dimension tables are related to each other. So if you have a table like a customer table or a list of invoices and you want to relate those two together, they need to have a common attribute. So in that case, it would be something like a customer number. And when you have many fact tables that are related to one dimension, it makes reporting so much simpler because you can add up values across those fact tables and do math across those fact tables and then report it against common dimensions. Let me show an example that kind of demonstrates some of these concepts and hopefully helps lock it in. And I'll start with this diagram. And I didn't create this diagram just for this presentation to show a star schema. This is actually when I'm building a new data model, this is the kind of table that I'll put together just so that I kind of understand how the star schema is going to look, and make sure it's clear in my mind that I know which of these things are facts and which of these things are dimensions. So you'll see in the diagram across the top, you'll see my fact tables. These are things like invoice amounts and payments amounts. I've got a statistics table in my example. And then down the left-hand side, those are my dimensions. And so I've got customers and date attributes and invoice attributes. And in the middle, it's how do these two things relate to each other, right? So how does invoice amounts relate to customers? What's the relationship defined? So I kind of build out this diagram so that I understand my model and I understand where I'm trying to get to. And then I replicate this model in Power BI. And obviously you need to pull in data and massage your data, but at some point you're going to get to the point of creating the relationships in the data. And so when you're creating the relationships, it's important to to have this fact and dimension that's related to each other. Obviously, you need one more piece of information that you can see in the Power BI user interface here, which is which specific columns from your fact relate to which specific column on your dimension. So that's data modeling, and I hope that helps kind of have some simple concepts around data modeling, just understanding the star schema, understanding how the facts and dimensions relate to each other in a simple way will help you go a long way, understanding that you have to do some transformations to get the data into a format that makes these relationships easy. Okay, so we talked about data models, and now my next tip is around how to separate the data models and the reports in PowerBI.com. And when I talk about this separation, I want to be clear. I'm talking about like reports that you're going to publish to an organization. So this isn't really talking about, your fantasy football draft Power BI file. That's fine if you lump it all together, or if you're just doing an ad hoc analysis report, it's fine to keep all these together. So I'm just talking about like reports you're going to publish to PowerBI.com, and you're trying to publish them to a group. Then this concept of separating the data model and the report becomes important. And the basic concept is you're going to split these things into two different files instead of having them all in one file. And splitting them is advantageous in your data model. You're trying to create a number of things in the data model, including the source data, the transformations, the relationships, the calculations, and the security. You're trying to put all of that stuff in the data model. And the report file is basically what the end user sees, right? So that's like tabs and visuals and slicers and other UI elements. That stuff belongs in the report file. Now, there's a number of different reasons why you want to do this separation. One is you're hopefully going to write many reports against the data model. That's kind of the, a big goal of BI, is this concept of having a single source of truth. Well, if you have a data model, every report has its own data model, it's harder to do that. It's harder to get a single source of truth that all the reports are pointing at. So separating the files into two lets you write many reports. If I had more chickens, you'd see many chickens on the report side and only one chicken on the data model side. So that's kind of that separation helps you to generate that structure. And I'll give an example here on the next slide. Having a separation also helps you make updates to the data model file. So if you need to fix a calculation because it's wrong, or you need to ingest more data and have that propagate to all the reports, now you only have to update one file instead of many files. It can also help in some test production scenarios. So if your Power BI file is pointed at a test database and then it needs to be repointed at your production database, there's only one file to repoint, and then all the reports are also being repointed up to the other database. So there's a lot of reasons to do that. It makes life way simpler when you separate it out. It gets you into some good BI habits of maintaining your data models as something separate. And overall, you're just going to have a better time of building out your Power BI solution. All right, so let's take a look at how this works. We've got powerbi.com. It's up there in the clouds. And we're going to start with our data model file. That's just a normal Power BI desktop PBIX file. And you can kind of see in the screenshot here, there's no reports, no visuals, just like one blank tab in the data model file. It's just the calculations and the tables and the relationships. That's all that's being maintained in this file. So that file is going to be published up to powerbi.com. The lineage view in powerbi.com shows this concept quite nicely. So the lineage view kind of shows the fact that I started with an Excel file, I put a data model file on top of it, and I've written some reports against that data model file. So you can kind of see the progression from original source data to end user reports through this view. But in this case, I've got my data model published. Back in Power BI desktop, you're going to create a new file. And in that new file, you select a Power BI dataset. And so that dataset's going to be the data model that you just published. Next up, write your beautiful reports against that dataset. And just like you normally would. I think the one exception is when you kind of publish these things this way, if you need to make a change to a table or a calculation, you do have to go back to the data model file and republish it. And make your edits there, and then you refresh your report file and the new data model will show up in the report file. So you make all the changes, make beautiful reports, user-friendly reports, and then there's one more publish step because now these report files are getting published up, and you can see here the lineage of having a couple of reports pointing at the same data model. One other tip is when you publish these things, unfortunately, even though that data model file only has a blank tab, it still does get published as a report, but there is a way in powerbi.com, you just click on the ellipses, delete that report, and it'll go away. Hopefully that's something Microsoft will fix in the future where you don't have to publish a report, but today you do have to manually delete that. Okay, so that's separating data models and reports. So Power BI Desktop is actually two apps in one, and this is not obvious when you first open Power BI Desktop and get into it and start writing reports. It kind of looks like one app, but I think there's some important points to make about why there's two apps and kind of why they're separate and some of the benefits that'll give you as you understand what the two apps are. So for me, this was interesting because when I was getting started, I would write an if statement in one app and it would go great because, it was DAX. So it was pretty much like writing an if statement in Excel. Okay, I can do Excel, so I kind of understand DAX. But then I need to do a data transformation somewhere else. And so I'd go over there and write the if statement the same way. And Power BI is just like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, hey, Power BI, I just wrote an if statement and you were just fine. And why are you angry at me now? So, since then it's okay. We've hugged, we've made up, we understand each other better now. But that's kind of the user experience you can end up with if you don't understand the differences and what the two apps are. So let me try to explain. There's first app inside of Power BI Desktop is the Designer app. That's where you create all of your visuals. That's where you define relationships. That's where you put in calculations. That's where you do security. Like all of that kind of visual end user layer that's on top of Power BI. That is the Designer app. Then the second app is Power Query. And Power Query is a tool for loading and transforming data. And that Power Query user interface is opened with a button that says Edit Queries. And actually, when you click on that Edit Queries button, if you look at the top, it'll actually say Power Query, and it opens everything up in another window. So Power Query is the second app that's kind of embedded inside of Power BI Desktop. And some of the get data functions that you use may also be related to Power Query, because Power Query is like ingesting the data into your file. So when you click on, I think one of the important takeaways is just to remember that Edit Query button is going to take you into another world, and that other world is going to do some different things than the Designer part of the app. So why does this matter? I'll give a few different reasons. So first of all, you can end up dealing with two different languages. So going back to my if statement example earlier, Power Query has a language called M, the letter M, and the Designer app has a language called DAX, which I referred to before, which is very useful in, very similar to Excel. You just kind of need to remember those letters because, when you're learning a tool like Power BI, you're going to Google everything anyways. And so you need to know if I'm in one experience, I need to be Googling for DAX stuff. And if I'm in the other experience, I need to be either Googling for Power Query or M stuff. And then I'll find the right answer. I'll find the right way to do my if statement depending on where I'm at. Another interesting thing is that Power Query actually shows up in more applications than just Power BI. So Power Query shows up in powerbi.com. It's called Data Flows in powerbi.com. But if you go into the Data Flows UI, you'll recognize it as being identical to the Power Query UI back in Power BI Desktop. And the same kind of thing as Excel. So on the Excel side, also you can use Power Query. So interestingly, if you've started to get into Power BI Desktop and you're familiar with this Edit Queries experience, you actually know a program that's more broadly applicable than Power BI Desktop, and you can start searching out some different places to use Power Query that's not just inside of Power BI Desktop. On the Designer side, the Designer is more specific to Power BI, but it does show up in a couple places. So obviously in Power BI Desktop, but in powerbi.com, there's an edit button. And in that edit button, you'll get a pretty familiar design experience where you can pull in fields and change visuals and those kind of things in that Designer experience. So again, if you understand the Designer experience in the desktop, you can kind of take that knowledge to another place and apply it inside of powerbi.com. And finally, it can matter which experience you're in for the performance of your reports, because Power Query is doing a lot of pre-processing when it's bringing in data into the Power BI model. And that's all kind of calculated beforehand. Before the user ever shows up, Power Query has already kind of done its thing and got the data all staged the way you want it. Whereas in the Designer app, a lot of the stuff that's happening that you're doing in the Designer app is happening when the user's running the report. So from a performance perspective, ideally, you'd like to push as much stuff into the pre-processing category as you can, and the user is only having minimal amounts of stuff coming in, or processing as they're running the report. So those are the two apps. Like I said, it's not terribly confusing. You can kind of work your way through it and kind of muddle through it. I think the most confusing part for me was like knowing what to Google and how to search for things because I didn't understand it was two different applications, and I was really struggling to find the right information that was solving the problem that I was working on, or the right kind of training to get to, do a specific task in Power BI. So just remembering that it's two different things can go a long way to make things simpler. Speaking of Power Query and DAX, another common question is, well, when should I use both, right? When should I use the M language and M calculations, and when should I use DAX calculations? And there's no perfect answer to these, but I'll try to give some general guidelines about the types of things you're trying to do. And so let's start with M. So in general, you want to use M for data transformations, right? That's, again, Power Queries ingesting the data. Now the data is sitting there, and you can do some transformation logic. You can join things together. You can add a column to your report. You can, kind of do some transformations like, okay, if my data source says 0, make that false, and if it says 1, make it true. You can do those kind of simple, if statement type transformations to make one value into another value. Or maybe you need to split the columns. Maybe you have one column that needs to become 2 columns. That's another example of what you can do with M. So all those kind of data changes, that's where M can really help. Also changing the column type. If you want to change something from a string to a number or a number to a string, that can be done or is commonly done with M. Renaming things is commonly done with M, because you can kind of getting your data models organized and getting them put together with the more friendly names maybe than the source system. So renaming is a good use case for M. And then finally, if you need to do certain types of math, especially row-level math, that's better done in the M user interface. And when I say row-level math, you may have a data set that includes a quantity and a price field, but doesn't extend that out to an amount field. And you want to extend it out to amount on every single row so you can add it up. That's M. That's quantity times price on every row. M makes it very easy to do that kind of math calculation on a single row. In general, you want to use DAX for math, right? So, and a lot of math plus filters, right? So you can use DAX for things like summing up a column. You can use, you can sum up a column but filter the column on certain values, like, give me, maybe I sum up sales, but then maybe I want sales for last year, for example. That would be an example of a DAX calculation. So these are things you're doing across your data set. And they need to, by definition, they need to be done at runtime because the user is maybe slicing and dicing by different dimensions. And so you want to kind of bring that that experience, that math needs to happen as the user is interacting with the report. Date comparisons are also very common. I mentioned last year, you can have formulas that refer back to how many days from today or how many days into the future from today. So those kind of calculations as well, because they're relative, and basically the calculation changes over time based on what day it is. So that would be another good use case for DAX. Now, let's be honest, all right? Even experienced Power BI report writers will tell you that sometimes we're all winging it. So, sometimes the, you can add columns with DAX. You can change types. You can join tables. You can rename things with DAX in the visual editor. On the M side, you can do things like you can certain filter type expressions. You can sort of pre-process how you want to do your filters, even in some of the data examples I gave. So that's why there's general rules. I guess the rule is for me, like whatever works. At the end of the day, if you can find a path and it's working for you, don't worry too much about where you're doing it. There's maybe it's sometimes a little more idealistic. A lot of times it doesn't matter, until you run into a performance problem, and then maybe you have to refactor a little bit. But If it works, then you're doing it the right way. And I want to thank my family for the great pictures, especially my mom, who's apparently now the face of DAX. I will have to explain to her after this presentation what DAX is, because she didn't realize she was going to become the face of DAX today. All right, next I want to talk about visual design. So it's really important to have good visual design for your users. And I just want to provide some tips on making a good report design. You want things to be easy, intuitive. You want your users to enjoy being in the reports. So hopefully with these tips, you'll be rocking and rolling here. So I got a window up here. It's just Power BI desktop, and I'm gonna, through the magic of PowerPoint, add some things into my visual. Starting with the title, of course. Users need to know what they're looking at and what the report is supposed to represent. And I like to add some slicers because users like to slice and dice the reports and, you know, do filters kind of every which way. Next up, add some visuals, you know, really pack them in. I got all kinds of charts, especially the more types of charts you can put into your report, I say the better. You know, so I got 4 visuals here, but frankly, I think that's not enough. I would suggest a lot of visuals. You really want to pack it in here. All kinds of things, nice pie charts, maybe a map. And of course, when you have all these visuals, what's the question you always get? What's the data? So you got to throw in some data here, data visual, so that, you know, when users slice and dice, they can see what's going on here. And finally, we probably need some more filters and slicers on here just to, you know, finish it out, give them a few more options on things to filter on. So that's pretty good. I think it's ready for production. I think we're ready to publish. Okay. All joking aside, you know, visual design is a topic that we can all disagree about, and there's lots of good versions of the truth when it comes to visual design. So I won't say there's any one specific path that you should go down, but I do think keeping it simple is an important and a common theme when you ask any visual designer. That's what they'll tell you. Keep things simple. Please don't put 600 visuals on the page. Your users will just like be a deer in headlights when they log into the report. They won't understand, you know, what the page is trying to do. So, you know, simple can mean different things. I think simple for me means that every tab in your report has a clear single purpose. You know, some people refer to this as a data story, you know, to kind of help them think about what story is the tab telling you or the report telling you. But I just like to think of it as, you know, what's the one purpose? You should be able to say in one sentence, this tab shows me this, or this tab helps me decide this. You know, like there should be a simple sentence that describes the purpose of your report. You know, and it's kind of funny, you know, I showed the funny slide with all the visuals on it. But interestingly enough, a lot of times when I've sat in on like sales demos, that's exactly what they show. When you're selling BI, it's like people want to see how many visuals they can dump onto one page. And then if you actually go to deliver that to a user, they look at it and go, you know, I don't know what you're talking about. So, you know, so there's kind of a difference in how people perceive BI and how many things they think they want on a page and what people are actually able to consume. Another tip is, you know, on the simple front is color. So I would say just focus color on the data and the not the background, not the titles. You know, there can be some color, but most of the color should be focused in on the data itself. If you look at modern applications, that's what it is. A lot of the background is gray or white. and you want the user to focus on what's important, which is the numbers. Another thing on colors, be careful about colors because color blindness is a thing and accessibility is important. So, if you're using a red color for bad and yellow for, warning and green for good, that may make sense to you, but to some people that's just different shades of gray. And so you're not showing them the information. So you do want to be a little bit careful from a colors perspective, and how the colors are used and not assume that people will perceive color in the same way you do. I think consistency is important to make things simple. So having your reports with a similar look and feel across different reports in the organization. So users don't go into one report and it's just designed completely differently than another report. So they have kind of a similar user experience. And the other thing about simple is you don't always have to fill up the page. It's kind of an inclination with Power BI that because you have this sort of fixed size page that you always want to fill it up with stuff. And sometimes, especially in early versions of the report, you want to leave yourself a little breathing room. Start out with fewer visuals, just focus on what you're trying to do, and kind of gives you some room to grow as you get user feedback and allows you to place more stuff. And finally, simple for me means that it's maintainable. So if whoever authored the report realizes that BI is too crazy for them and they want to go join the circus instead because they want a simpler lifestyle, then the next person in line needs to be able to kind of look at what they've done and be able to maintain what they've done. So you can get into some crazy BI scenarios of just overcomplicated stuff, and if nobody else can maintain it, it's probably not a good structure for the organization. Finally, if you want to get better at design, my tip is to search out other reports. There's, hundreds of examples of Power BI reports online that you can just Google and find Power BI examples and just look at them. Look at them and say, what do you like about certain reports? What do you not like? And kind of write down those themes of what you like and don't like and try to put those themes into your own designs. That's how you can kind of come up with your own style. So, and I think it is important to come up with your own style. Like I said at the beginning, there's no right answer to design. Design's in the eye of the beholder. I think in Power BI, good design is that, you can look at a report and make good decisions out of the data. Okay, the next tip is about OneDrive and syncing up your reports and having kind of a publishing workflow to your reports. So what's easy to happen in Power BI is somebody publishes a report and then somebody else makes a change. Maybe they make a change in powerbi.com, or they download the PBIX file and then they publish that back up, and then the first person publishes their file. And all of a sudden you get like changes overriding each other. And merging in changes in Power BI is nearly impossible. It's a very manual task to merge in changes. So if you're going to deploy reports to a group, it's important to have kind of this file management workflow so that you have consistency and that you're always getting the same report and the source file is always getting updated as revisions are made and new versions are published. So I'm going to describe one potential process that I find to be the easiest default process with some tools we already have in Office 365. So the process starts either in a SharePoint site or a Teams group is very common now, a workspace. If you go into powerbi.com and in a workspace and click on Files, you'll get this sync button. Or if you go to Office 365 to a group, you'll get this sync button. So the sync button exists in many places, but it's all kind of related to this OneDrive Office 365 file storage. And what happens is when you click that sync button, the OneDrive app is going to take the files in that folder and sync them locally to your computer. So now you have the same files in the cloud as you have on your computer. And, anytime the files are changed on your computer, it's putting up to the cloud. If the files are changed in the cloud, it's putting it back down on your computer. So you always have it in sync, so you always have the latest files. And this is important if you have many users editing the same files. Now everybody's kind of basically pointing at the same files. Of course, you have your business analysts. They're working in Power BI desktop, so they're editing these files locally. And having the files locally with OneDrive makes it very easy. You can just open up the folder, open up the file, and you're in the editing experience. You don't have to worry about going to manually do a lot of files. So that business analyst is just saving files like they normally would, and everything else is happening automatically. Now, when the business analyst publishes files to PowerBI.com, in this scenario, you're never using PowerBI.com for your editing experience. You're only using Power BI Desktop to publish up to PowerBI.com and doing your editing experience only in Power BI Desktop. So PowerBI.com then just becomes a consumption/viewing experience where your users are looking at the reports, consuming the reports, and interacting with the reports up in PowerBI.com. So this is my suggested workflow. Now, there are some good cases to, for example, create an ad hoc report in PowerBI.com. I've done that many times. That's more of maybe like a disposable report that you're not going to have to manage in the same way. That's certainly, there are scenarios where you can kind of break this, but for a normal workflow where you're, just trying to publish reports to a group, I think this is a really solid workflow to use. So on the licensing front, I'll definitely give credit to the Power BI team at Microsoft. I feel like they've made the licensing pretty simple, which isn't always easy for Microsoft Power Apps. But Power BI is really simple, straightforward, and there's good value in the free license. I really like it when companies come up with a way to give things away for free, so there's broad user adoption and you kind of cast a very wide net. And then, at a certain point, yes, you got to start paying money. Everybody's got to make money at a certain point, but I feel like Power BI does a really good job of kind of drawing that line. I think, one of the pitfalls of having something free is it can be overpromised. I think if people really don't understand the licensing model, it may be easy to say, oh, well, you can download Power BI for free. Well, that sounds great until you get into the details of what you get for free, and that may not be meeting the needs of the organization. The other time I hear free is like, oh, Power BI is free if you have premium. And premium is actually very expensive. It's like, I think $5,000 a month to start. So to me, that's not exactly free. That's like $5,000 a month. So you could say that, viewers are included with premium, but that's not the same thing as being free with premium. Okay, so that's kind of, something to keep in mind. It's good licensing, simple licensing, for the $10 Pro license. But let me just kind of explain each of the license types and what you get. So on the free license, it's for personal BI, right? So you can get Power BI Desktop for free, and download author reports. You can use Power BI, just like Excel on your desktop. You don't have to log in. You can just, go crazy and write whatever reports you want. And it's personal because you can publish it to yourself. So you can publish it to PowerBI.com, but only to my workspace, right? So that's a workspace just for you, only for your reports that you can consume. So this is good for ad hoc style reports. It's good for, I don't know, your gardening report. Those kind of scenarios are fine for the free license, or for try before you buy scenarios. You know, maybe you just want to get into Power BI and see if it's a good tool for your organization. Everybody can download it, grab some data from your source system, and, you know, start ingesting it. So those two scenarios are really good for free. I think, you know, you got to be careful, especially in our space. The Dynamics Finance and Operations comes with a free Power BI license, but it's just not the same. It's a different, it's like a different Power BI, and it doesn't have all the same features as PowerBI.com. And so those distinctions are important to understand before like over-promising on what it can do. So that's the free side. And then on the pro side, I think it's a great price. I think $10 per user is really fair. If you look at other BI offerings, you know, Power BI is you know, quite cost effective for organizations. But this pro license is for sharing reports between teams or departments or your whole organization, right? Where we want everybody looking at the same report. That's where you start needing the pro license for every user. There's some limitations in the pro license that you can get into, like the size of your data set or the amount of memory your data set can consume. So you can't just throw infinite amounts of data in the pro license. You will run into some caps there. So that's important to keep in mind that, that there are caps there. But Microsoft offers other tools. I mentioned Premium earlier. So if you run up against caps, you can use Premium. There's a tool called Azure Analysis Services. There's like other things you can use to, kind of scale up your solution. But Pro is really good for kind of a starter pack for sharing reports in the organization. All right, and now it's time for the Q&A portion of our, Kool-Aid Man. Oh, right, I promised 8.5 concepts and I only gave 8. So, I really wish Kool-Aid Man would like bust through my wall every time I make a mistake. I think that would be a lot of fun. And I probably have no walls left. But that brings me to my final tip here, which is to have fun. So have fun with Power BI. It's a visual tool, right? So visual tools give you a lot of flexibility in the things you can do. And, so whether it's getting creative with what kind of visuals you're doing. I found one online where, I don't know, just funny thing with Homer inserted into the visual. You can do some unique visuals. You can download, I mentioned the fish and it was in a couple slides here, but it's just kind of a funny visual where the fish grow in different sizes and it's a fun visual, fun to see on a report. I don't know that it's terribly informative, but it's definitely cool. And, sometimes when you're trying to get users into a tool like Power BI, cool is better than informative to get the momentum a little bit. So, and then there's other tools, maybe think of them as more advanced tools, but maybe not to be forgotten, things like HoloLens. You can have Power BI on your mobile phone. You can have Power BI on an Apple Watch. There's a Q&A feature in Power BI that I don't think is, very highly used. So there's all these little, sort of tentacles that Power BI can get into that can add fun for your user base. So that's my last half a tip, is to have fun with Power BI, have fun creating visuals. And I think that fun will be reflected in your reports and your user adoption. Thank you for attending if you're watching it after the fact. If you'd like to contact me, again, I'm Joel Leichty. I run the Power practice for Dynamic Consulting, and my contact information is up here and our website. So that's where you can find me at work. And then I like to give back to the community through events like this and blogs. I'm actually working on a blog series that covers these 8.5 points on my website. So feel free to visit joelleichty.com, and you can follow me on Twitter and connect with me on LinkedIn if you'd like to interact about other Power BI stuff. I'd like to thank DynamicsCon and the community for voting for this session and for getting a chance to be a part of this. And thank you.